Hey everyone, Juba here, and I am joined by Cory Barlog, the director of the new God of War.
Hello everybody.
And also joined by Tim Abramson, who is going to be playing God of War 2.
A blast from the past. Let us step in our time machine.
You feeling confident? Can we do normal?
I don't know, man.
By defeating Ares, Kratos.
So I remember thinking that this intro was such a badass payoff to the end of the first game.
Yeah, connecting all the way. You sat down in the throne and picked up right there. I'm really big on trying to connect things so that it feels like when you end one thing, you're picking up almost right where you left off. That's why the end of this game, spoilers for anyone riding the back of Gaia, going up to take on Zeus, was always meant to be the very beginning of 3. I just love that feeling of if you wanted to, you could play all 3 back to back and feel like it's a continuous adventure.
Yeah. Well, and I remember at the end of the first game, this sort of sense of I've beaten Ares and now I'm a god, and how do you follow up on that?
Right.
How do you pay off on that promise?
Yeah, that was a lot of pressure to figure out. One, how do you pay it off, and then also take them back down a peg so that they have somewhere to go, right? Because it's the Castlevania Symphony of the Night thing was sort of the inspiration of feeling beginning of that game, you're super powered up, and then death steals all of your stuff. And then you want to get it all back. And I was like, I love that. That was a really cool moment from my sort of early gaming history. So I kind of was inspired by that for this whole beginning, to have the big action beginning. You get all of your toys. You can do so much stuff. And then Zeus takes it away. Spoilers.
Yeah. And it's got to be hard to not make players feel cheated when that happens, though, too.
Yeah, I mean, it's invariably there's the collection of players that are going to feel cheated. But, I mean, hopefully, narratively, we kind of brought them along for the ride.
Yeah.
We had an early conversation about the Colossus of Rhodes and saying we really need to make a scenario in which the Colossus was still under construction, and the reason that it was sort of destroyed wasn't because of, sort of being lost to history during some sort of battle, but really it was embodied by Zeus.
And killed by Kratos.
Yeah, and just destroyed by Kratos.
So, at what point during the development, I actually should have pointed out, in addition to directing the new God of War, Cory was the director of God of War 2, the game we were playing right now.
Yes. First director to come back for a second go around.
Yeah.
A second round of pain.
So at what point in the actual timeline of developing God of War 2, when did you make this intro sequence?
This was one of the last things that we had done. We were deliberately holding off on our opener. We wanted to make that the last thing so that we had learned all the lessons we could possibly learn. The engine was running the best it could. Artists had sort of found all the tricks they could find. Mm-hmm. It was basically the wait until we are our best selves before we tackle this.
Yeah.
Which worried the production team greatly. There was a point actually where the producer was so frustrated that we hadn't started on it that he just modeled the interior of the Colossus and kind of set it up, and it was just horrible. The metrics were bad. You couldn't jump on things properly. Mike Chang, the lead level designer, was very frustrated and saying, why did we do this? And they were just like, you're not doing it. And I'm very frustrated. We need to get this done. It's hard to get everyone to have faith to say, just wait till the end. And we worked some pretty long hours to get this thing done. But end of the day, Eric Williams was the sort of lead combat guy on this thing and was able to pull it together through all the crazy experiences.
I can understand how that would be stressful, though, because you're sort of... you have your one chance to make your first impression at the beginning, right? And if that doesn't come together, then it could sort of be a problem.
Yeah, and we knew the high level. It was like, okay, you're going to essentially be stalked by this massive colossus throughout this journey on the city, and we had the concept art and a few key areas and then a bunch of big ideas. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think it made all of the production and even the leads also very worried, just because it was in its concept way bigger than this. If you can imagine, at the time, it was longer. Anything I ever do, it just feels like is just so blown out. It's like James Clavell presents, it's like a Kevin Costner movie all the time. I just go way too far with it. But it's having learned that you have to have a lot to get rid of. You have to have a lot to sort of sacrifice, and reach a compromise and say, okay, I'll get rid of this, but we need to keep this. And we always have this thing is no matter what game we worked on, and I think this was even with the handheld games, the first 2 games and the 3rd game, and even the current game, people are like always pointing out, Kratos is a god, he can take down these giant creatures, yet he struggles with a chest. And I was like, guys, this is a concession you just sort of have to accept. It's like people who question, where does Batman fill up the gas in the Batmobile before it was nuclear powered.
Yeah.
You don't imagine him at 3 a.m. trying to get a fill up. And I think it is just one of those concessions that in order to get the dynamics within the game, yes, sometimes you have to struggle and press the button to lift up a gate.
Yeah.
But he can lift up, the world with Atlas. And it is that you'd never, I think, be able to have any dynamics in the game if it was always adhering to that one reality.
Yeah. So in the new God of War, does Kratos ever have to gingerly balance across a beam?
We don't have that, but we do have several moments that kind of harken back to that idea a little bit. So you can see that the Colossus hand shake a little bit. We were experiencing then, and still now experiencing, some problem with, I don't know if I'm 100% correct on the way this is defined, but the sort of floating point math and calculations that the Colossus was so big that his center point is so far from the 0, 0, 0 point of the world that the math starts to get a little bit wonky and the compression starts to get a little bit shaky. So they said, stop making things so big. Little did they know we were going to end the game with something that was 20 times larger, 100 times larger than the Colossus.
Whoa.
So I was always laughing, saying, this is really the easy part. Wait till you get to the next game. So yeah, like making things really, really large in a world that is continuous is a dramatic challenge for the programming team. We're always fortunate to have such smart people.
The idea of telling the God of War team to stop making things so large seems like kind of...
like, ha ha ha, fools, you fools!
So was the Colossus at the time that you did this like the biggest thing you'd try to do in the series at this point?
I think so, yeah. We had the big version of Ares and the Minotaur in God of War 1, and that one evolved over such time. Like, when we first were doing this, the idea of Kratos stepping into the catapult and launching himself up wasn't part of the original pitch. We knew we were going to figure something out, but it was just kind of one of those late night, what we should do? We should try this. And I think that's honestly a lot of our boss battles kind of begin with a core idea, but it's just getting all those right people together that just say, I have this really crazy idea. And at first, it's a good idea when everybody goes, no, that's crazy. And then I'm like, ooh, that's definitely what we should do. If you don't like it because you're afraid of it, then we should try it.
Interesting. Was there ever a point in like the planning of this sequence where like Kratos and the Colossus were sort of both huge, like Kratos and Ares style duking it out?
There was a thought, like when he starts, he was already gigantic. And we were like, we should do the first round should be the 2 colossi, rampage moment where they're just destroying the city. And then through the process of the fight, Kratos gets reduced down. Yeah. And that died due to scoping. So that first round where Kratos and the Colossus were huge just kind of became, okay, well, we've already done it with Ares. So if we had to lose something, let's just get you to the point where you're seeing David versus Goliath, right? Because the first tests, everybody was like, I couldn't really tell the scale. And we were actually going to let you play as giant Kratos approaching Rhodes and destroying a bunch of stuff so that in the city, you have Kratos punching these buildings and stuff like that. So basically, you were going to be approaching Rhodes and walking through this canyon and just like wrecking little like seaside cities and stuff because, that's what you do as the God of War. You just destroy stuff. And it was kind of am I a good guy, am I a bad guy? You don't really know. You sort of play into I'm having fun at this, but then you kind of realize a little bit later, oh wait, those were sort of innocent people, maybe. I don't know. The controversy here of when people have the mini games the sort of quick time event mini games. They say, "Oh, I don't want any more quick time events. They're so over." And then when they don't have them, they're like, "Why don't you have quick time mini games?" I personally after making this one, the second one was like, okay, I kind of am sort of done with these sort of quick time events.
Yeah.
The random button press ones. I think they're cool. You can create these cinematic moments, but I was far more partial to being able to manipulate the core mechanics and figure out ways to take down enemies. I mean, I like the finishers in that, but at one point we started to just make these things so long.
Yeah.
The Zeus fight at the end, man, so many potential screw-ups you could have. I started swimming. I took for granted.
Yeah.
You know, it was one of those things where when we did it, I was just like, oh, in God of War 1, they had already kind of nailed most of the 3D navigation. So I was doing most of the animations to kind of get the mechanics working really good. But when we started the new God of War, and I was talking about like, all right, well, here's all these core mechanics that I would like to include. Talking about the swimming and talking about a secondary character having full 3-dimensional navigation, right? And also when you're swimming and underwater, you can't talk, right? So there's this point of like, when we were doing the initial stuff for the boat and then being able to go in the water and potentially swim, it was a time where you really couldn't enjoy any of the stuff we're doing in the boat currently, which is all this great character building and world building and storytelling and development of the characters. So it was one of the first things in the new game that kind of ended up getting dropped of saying, we'll do this later because it really is a greater technical challenge than I ever thought. Because it's like, you take it for granted. You just sort of had it in the earlier ones, but man, it's really hard.
Well, and it's also hard to just like so many games have swimming or water sections or whatever, and I feel like that's a hard thing to actually make fun, even even beyond
and get
the
right
technical part.
and to feel right. Like that's the thing is like you take on the challenge, you're spending a considerable amount of time really nailing the feel of that, and it's like, all right, what's important here is more about the Atreus kind of involved in the entire game. So it's the pick your battles sort of thing, especially in this one, the sort of inclusion of the grappling and really kind of expanding upon the grappling was very important.
Yeah, so like coming out of God of War, the first one, which you also worked on, like what was sort of top of the list in terms of areas to improve for God of War 2?
I think I wanted to create an even greater suite of moves, but also really get you into the action as much as possible. More of these events, the foot smashing through the wall and you having to like push it back, and that just being a small event in a much larger experience. The idea of, you know, that Thomas Jane Punisher movie where he was fighting the Russian and they're just destroying the whole house and slamming the refrigerator in there and on his head, and just this feeling of a fight that could feel like not just you arrive at the boss fight location, you have the boss fight, but the boss fight can extend across an entire level. Right? And it can tell a story throughout all of it. That was kind of the one defining thing, is feeling like you never really can feel a beginning or an ending to a level. Like my philosophy always was this feeling of, I don't ever want anybody to go, this level is this and this level is that. I just want them to feel like the adventure, the journey is a whole experience, and you never really can tell where one begins and one ends.
Yeah, I think now my memory of this game has gotten a little hazy over the years, but I mean, I do remember specific areas, but I don't remember them being sort of discrete in that way you're talking about. It's like, oh, yeah, you're in the second area of the game.
Yeah, so it's like you finish this, you get on a Pegasus, you fly out to the end of the world, and then on the way there, you end up stopping at this mountain and then continuing on, and it feels like the thrust for me has always been that feeling of like you're getting the call to action and you're kind of going on this journey, and it never really feels, you know, level 2, chapter 1. You know, like while I appreciate games that do that, I just kind of like that feeling of never being reminded that I'm kind of in an experience like this, that it's not breaking up into chapters.
Well, I think it helps too with both the first God of War and this one sort of have times when you sort of return to areas that you've been in before, but sort of like with new capabilities or with new keys that you've, you know.
Or even seeing it from a different angle. Right? Like you're climbing above something that you were at before. And I think that that kind of folding in on itself design is very great. I mean, I love playing games like that where it feels like it's hub-based in some ways, but it's also simply just, this cyclical figure eight sort of design.
Yeah, it's got to be tricky to do that too without making players feel like they're backtracking.
Yes.
Also.
Oh, that's a delicate balance. And even then, you're always going to have some players who just feel like, no matter what you do, if they've seen the area before, they're done.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that's definitely an okay thing to see an area, but have a different take on it, different perspective.
So I see this first level.
What? You had to wait to die. That's fantastic. You are still playing far better than I.
Yeah. I see this intro sequence. Like, this makes a lot of lists of like best opening levels to games and
cool.
stuff like that, which I think is well deserved. Was there what would be some of your favorite beginnings to games apart from God of War series?
Ooh, I would say the opening to Last of Us is phenomenal in the sense of world building and character. That one sticks with me.
Yeah.
Quite a lot. Very happy with what we're doing on the current game, but nobody's seen that, so that doesn't really count yet.
Yeah, that's still
it's
secret
unfair.
Right now.
Yeah, I would say that the opening of the game and how we kind of handle it is different than we've handled it in the past. But there's still the sort of DNA of how we want to kind of have a big splash at the beginning. I think my initial philosophy was that Indiana Jones action opener, the very first thing you do is action, and I think that always led us to lean perhaps into the very surface level of Kratos as a character, and I think being able to take our time a little bit and appreciate the build so that when it really does hit you, it kind of hits you much harder. But it's, the opening of a game is very difficult and I think unique to each game you work on. And anything you plan never turns out how you originally intended it to. It evolves over the entire course of the project. This is one of those things too, because we waited so long for this, we ended up figuring out a lot of the gameplay as we were going, right? And he ended up having a lot more stages than I think if we were to completely design it out in advance that we would have ever allowed, but we just sort of were feeling our way through and finding what was fun and what people were responding to in the playtests. So it reminded me a lot of the story that Spielberg was telling about Raiders, that when he was going to shoot that fight scene with the monowing plane, and he still didn't know what the monowing plane looked like, and it was supposed to be just one punch, and the fight scene was over.
Yeah.
And he kept asking, like, hey guys, what is this going to look like? I got to start planning what my shot's going to be, and there, was a lot of drama about getting the monowing plane. So it didn't arrive until the day of, and he had no idea what it looked like. And then when he gets on set and he sees it, he goes, oh, we have to make this fight scene way bigger. So he and the camera guy basically just improvised and kind of choreographed the fight scene on the day of the shoot. And he said it was some of the most enjoyable filmmaking he had done up to that point in his career. And I was like, that's a lot of the times these sort of late game pieces are, me and the combat guys kind of just improvising and adding and figuring out what is the best. And it was, honestly, the Colossus was the most stressful, but also the most fun. That and the Barbarian King. That had that great, he drags you sequence. And we sort of, I think, went farther than we ever thought we would on every one of these moments.
Really?
Yeah, we would design something very big and think, okay, we're going to have to scale this back. And it turned out we could go even further in some cases than we ever thought we would.
So before we started recording here, you were talking about how one of the games that you played that is sort of a reference for God of War action, or at least pieces of it in there, was Bujingai.
Bujingai, yeah.
A sort of, I think it's fair to call that a kind of obscure PS2 game.
Oh,
right?
That's a totally obscure PS2 game. Very difficult to find when I wanted to get my own copy of it. Even at the time, when it first came out, it was still very difficult to find.
And I think I may be one of the few other people who's even played that game because I reviewed it when it came around for us. But what can you think of other games that you played that served as reference, or that were had little elements that you thought, ooh, that's a good idea that we need to try and work in here?
Yeah, Blood Will Tell. Is that the one where the guy's collecting the body parts?
That name sounds so familiar.
It's basically like a story about a guy who is wronged and has all of his body parts cut up and removed and sent to different parts of the world or something like that. And what he's doing is going and getting his vengeance and going back and like collecting each body part. So you're actually getting your arm back. And well, it's really just a bizarre game. There was really neat elements inside of that game.
Huh.
Rygar, the 3D
yeah.
remake, they had some really interesting elements that I played that when we were making God of War 1, and I was like, ooh, there's some neat stuff in there. Like Bujingai was, there's some really rapid fire moves that they do, the way they did their counter system. There's some of the stuff that we were looking at for potentially using wall run, which I, don't think we ended up using a lot of that. But, the grapple system, had a little bit of the inspiration from that, even though there wasn't really a grapple system. It was that freedom of movement in Bujingai that just felt like it was a giant playground. I was like, I want to figure out how we can recreate that or get a little bit of that into this game, because it was just so freeing, even though that game was very empty. Right? It really just felt like you were moving from empty space to empty space, but their combat system was fantastic.
I remember I always felt kind of bad for Rygar, because that was a game that
criminally underrated, man.
Yeah, I mean, people
so
played
good.
it, and I feel like people really liked it for the small bit of time that it was out before God of War.
Yeah.
And then God of War sort of overshadowed it in a way that, I think, now people think back to games in that style, and it's God of War and not Rygar that they think about. But
it's interesting because I had a similar experience to that on one of the first games I worked on in the game industry. It was called Requiem Avenging Angel. Terrible name. But it was a first-person shooter where you played an angel, and it had some neat ideas. You could boil people's blood, and they exploded. You could turn them into pillars of salt.
Okay.
So conceptually, there was some neat stuff in there. But when our game was getting finished is when the demo of Half-Life 1 came out. So we were right in the last stages of finishing. We were probably about a month away from finally when the free demo of Half-Life came out, and everybody at the office played it, went home for the weekend and had played it and came back and pretty much just said, we're dead. No one is going to care about this game. Our entire game is half of what the demo of Half-Life is.
Yeah.
It was insane. And it was very sad and very depressing. So I feel like Rygar had a similar sadness.
Yeah.
Because it is a great game. I played that game a lot, and while we were making this, and realized there's so many neat things. I remember trying to put this sequence together and actually get them to have archers there and trigger dialogue that says, there he is, get him. All of those little setups, which we take for granted now, were so hard to do. The sequence later in the game when you meet the soldier who's dead in the bog, and having him talk, and communicate with you, feeling like you're going into a bit of gameplay, but it's really a cinematic. It's an incredibly long time to set that up. And it was didn't work for the longest time in the game.
What was complicated about it?
Just getting the character to stay in place and play an idle animation until you went up and interacted with him, and then it would trigger into the cinematic. Just the alignment of all of that stuff.
Yeah.
The little peekaboo sequence here. This was almost cut because we weren't confident that it was going to do, because you had to tilt Kratos forward and drop him in there. We had a gray box version of it. It was really janky. Indignant Kratos shouting at the sky. A good portion of his life is spent screaming at the clouds. And then the Blade of Olympus is sent down. The only thing that can defeat. This is very much like that whole create the disease and then sell them the cure.
Yeah.
This is the essence of Zeus. He creates the problem, and then he gives you the ability to take care of it, only to realize that it was the trick to rid Kratos of his power. Because Dad cannot have son overshadow him.
Man.
It's like the essence of this entire game really is this sort of struggle with your dad, right?
Yeah.
And the first drafts that my dad and I wrote together on this one, we were kind of trying to figure out, like I was steering him in this crazy direction, and he kept saying, is this really the way to go? Is this a story that is connecting with people? Do you think it's going to work? I'm like, it's totally going to work. And we would argue about it back and forth. And it was through those arguments that I think both of us sort of realized, like, you know what? It's really a father-son story in the sense that it is the son, like, growing to a point where the father is fearing him.
Yeah.
Right? And that sense of, like, the Greeks had that sort of constant cycle, right? Of Zeus. He knows how he treated his dad, so clearly he's like, my son is going to do the same thing to me. I better do that first.
Does Kratos know that Zeus is his father at this point in the story?
No.
Okay.
No, he doesn't find that out until a little bit later.
But that is in this game that revelation happens. Okay.
Yeah, we actually maybe we. The funny thing is, there is inside the menu of God of War 1, there is a line in the song where someone is singing in the background, and they're actually saying, Kratos, son of Zeus.
What?
Nobody caught it.
What?
Yeah. I didn't even catch it. Jaffe actually told me that. I was like, what? Are you kidding me? Like, it was totally in there. I think we actually do tell you in the first game because, the Gravedigger is actually Zeus constantly referencing back, and I think he calls him his son at the end of this whole sequence.
Yeah.
So he basically says, refers to him as my son, but I don't know if we fully refer to him as father yet.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, I remember, speaking of stuff hidden in God of War 1, those, like, the potential ideas for sequels or follow-ups. I think that was, like, in the extras menu.
Yes, that's Jaffe's way of making sure that whoever directed the next game had to do something that he had already come up with. I don't know if he didn't think that there was going to be another one or what, but I was just like, man, he already had laid out, like, all these different stories, so. Yeah. But it was good, because it kind of gave a little bit of information to mine so that people could see it and realize that, like, the reference towards Deimos actually became pertinent in Ghost of Sparta. So, and that was actually the original script for 3. So the script that I wrote for 3 had, instead of, what was her name? I can't remember the little automaton girl that they used in the labyrinth in 3.
Pandora?
Pandora, there you go. Yeah. I don't know, why did I not remember that? I was going in a totally different direction there. But that actually was referencing more towards Deimos. So that you would end up leading more back to Deimos as opposed to kind of Pandora, the box, and Hope and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then when that was cut out, I was like, cool, that works for me, because then I'll just use the Deimos angle on the Ghost of Sparta script, which after I had left, that was one of the first things that I had done was wrote the Ghost of Sparta script.
Oh yeah, and that's another interesting point. Like, for this series, a lot of people think of, like, mobile, or not mobile, like the handheld versions as sort of being like lesser entries in the series or something. And
we treated them as part of the sort of core thread.
Yeah.
So they killed it. Like, I was very happy working with those guys.
Well, and you mentioned too Dave Jaffe in the first game, but he was involved for a bit of the production of this one, right?
A little bit. I mean, he definitely these games pretty much shreds you when you finish one of these. So your brain is just scrambled eggs at that point, and it's very hard to get back into it. So he was off already immediately doing his thing, and I think I would check in with him, and we've had several conversations, I think in the early months, and then he kind of faded off, did his own thing, then came back, I think, when we had gotten about 60% or 65% of the way through the game, and then kind of gave some notes on various aspects of it, which some of them I was like, this is great. That's a really great idea. And then others, he was just like, I don't like this at all. You should really just cut this completely. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really agree with that. So I'm just going to keep going where I'm going to go.
And you felt like you had the sort of the license, the sort of creative control that you had to make the game you wanted to?
Oh yeah, like he was pretty insistent on that right from the beginning of saying, one, I'm tired, I don't want to, do this, but you got to kind of make it your own. And I think that was the thing we pushed with all the directors. Each time a new person was taking over, they really had to find their way in to the story, something that worked for them. There was a lot of rules that you sort of stayed within the canon, but beyond that, we wanted people to have the freedom to sort of tell the story that they wanted to tell, because they were going to have to be in the trenches for the years and struggle.
Yeah. And is that the sort of message you, did you pass that along to Stig when he took on for 3?
Yeah. It was interesting because we had gotten a lot more of the development, so that when I kind of stepped in on 2, we were finishing up 1 when we talked about this, so I started doing drafts of various scripts and ideas and was working with Jaffe early on. But with 3, I was already laying out a lot of the game, already writing the whole script, so he sort of inherited a lot more than I think any of the other previous directors had.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I was just like, look, you got a lot to work with here, but you go wherever you need to go. It's you got to live with this thing for the next few years, so it has become your baby of whatever you're going to do with it. Except I sort of did the same thing Jaffe did with the whole secret endings piece by ending 2, going up the side of the mountain. You're really not going to get out of that one. You pretty much have to pay off the Gaia fight. I kind of locked him into that. And there was, at the end of this one, similar things with the secret murals that were kind of placed there. And they did the similar thing at the end of 3. They placed a few secret murals, which, may or may not have canon connection to them.
And that you just mentioned the Gaia fight, and that reminded me, this is the game with the revelation that the narrator from the first game was an actual character.
Yes.
Was that known during the course of the first game, or was that a decision you made for 2?
That was me kind of as I was trying to look at connecting all these things, I was like, it'd be really cool to sort of take a little bit of that stranger than fiction concept of the idea of the narrator crossing over into the life of the narrated. It's also, I think, for me, one of my sort of greatest creative blunders when it comes to not establishing it strong enough. It was a really good lesson in, I had a lot of opportunities that I could have introduced it better and really made it a smoother transition so that it felt like it naturally developed. We cut a lot of moments and acknowledgments of Kratos kind of hearing. So there was never really the moments in the gameplay building up to here where the narrator starts talking and he almost acknowledges that he's hearing something.
Yeah.
He doesn't necessarily hear the exact words, but he connects a little bit so that the transition doesn't just become he gets, pulled down into hell and she pulls him out. So it's a little reference back to the Athena pulling him out of the water thing. But I think there was more I could have done to that to actually make it smoother.
It's interesting. It's interesting for me to hear you say that, just because I remember that moment just being jaw-dropping for me, where it was like,
oh really?
Yeah, where Kratos had died, and that was something I could not allow. And I'm like, wait a minute, the narrator's in first person? Who is this?
Which I thought that alone would have been the nice transition. But we had a couple of other moments where he was like, huh? He was acknowledging it. It wasn't full on I hear everything, but it was just, we would indicate just a tiny bit so that when you get that sense of the narrator switching from, third to first, you're like, oh my God. Some people liked it, some people didn't, but we didn't. I think the other problem with this game, for me at least, was we always had the phantom of the ashes reveal floating over our heads, because it was such an amazing moment in the game, the first game, that, oh my gosh, here's a character who's wearing the ashes of his dead wife and child. Right? That's a really hard reveal to top,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it became the touchstone for a lot of interviews on the second one. How are you going to top that? How are you going to top that? And I think we sort of got stuck in this cycle of believing that was our job, was to top whatever we did in the previous one.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that led to a lot of stagnation in our growth because we became sort of this constant in this constant competition with ourselves. We were in one-upsmanship with ourselves instead of really saying, what's the core story we want to tell here? What's interesting? How are we driving the character and the world forward while also growing things?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think
Oh yeah, you gotta
use that first.
stun him with that, and then go up and get the sword. So you're basically trying to get the opportunity.
And each phase, it gets a little bit more complicated or harder to sort of get that.
Yeah. So what
stuff.
you're doing is you're actually sacrificing your sort of powers into the blade, right? So that you can make it uber powered up,
Right.
but you're also making yourself weaker.
Yeah, which is Zeus's whole trick with this thing.
So it's basically like you're able to use this ultimate weapon, which is a vessel for the powers of a god, and that will help you defeat this. But really, it's just a trap. Like Admiral Akbar says, it's a trap.
Oh man, I forgot it. So he lost his hand in one of those wheels before, right?
Yeah. When you had trapped it in there. That was the thing we like to do, which sometimes wasn't part of the original boss concepts, is really kind of dragging things out and connecting. So the losing of the hand in one phase and then the hand returning as part of the fight.
Yeah.
When you're on the griffins and you kill that one guy with the Spear of Destiny and the griffin crashes. And then later when you're on the island, you find the dead griffin and you find the spear.
Yeah, yeah.
Like those kinds of things, we like the idea of them, but we usually would figure them out as we went, this is the perfect opportunity for something like that.
Yeah.
And in maintaining that flexibility to kind of say, okay, this is it, we can use this here. That's a big part of, I think, why these games turn out the way that they do, because we don't always hold ourselves to, oh, well, we didn't design this from the beginning, it must be like this. It's really just that freedom to say, this would be amazing if we tried this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you can see your whole magic bar is going down. First you sacrifice all your red orbs, and now you sacrifice your magic bar. And like piece by piece, you're sort of giving it into the blade.
I do like that there's at least, I mean, obviously people, like players can see the strings behind, like, we need to take away your powers. But I do like that explanation better than just like the beginning of a Metroid game where for whatever reason Samus just like doesn't have all the stuff
Right.
she picked up last time.
Well, the inspiration for this one was, again, going back to Half-Life, which is, you know, honestly, I think most game designers and game makers in general have some point of inspiration from Half-Life. It was such a fundamental shift in how we play games, how we make games, how we look at games. But the beginning of that game, unlike most other games, really put the player in the position of power when it came to the inciting incident. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just something happened and I got to fix it. It was a scientist saying, hey, Gordon, help me out here.
Yeah.
And then, go over and do this. And everything you did led to the opening, spoilers, of the rift to the other world. Like, you did this, so you're invested and you need to fix it.
Yeah.
And I was like, when we do this, I love the beginning of Symphony of the Night, but death just sort of shows up and takes all your crap.
Yeah,
what if
yeah.
you, thinking you're going to get more power, you're going to do something to defeat these guys, essentially sacrificed all of your powers one by one. Like one by one, you gave up all the powers, and then bam, you feel super powerful. You have this great weapon. You're like, look at me, I'm awesome. Not realizing that this is going to lead to your undoing. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, look over here, the misdirection will kind of lead you to your undoing. The flamethrower
weird
hand.
flamethrower thing.
This is our love of Army of Darkness.
I like the idea of the Colossus being winded too. Like this giant supernatural monster.
Everybody's got a stun state, right? It's just so natural. It's always funny that you have to find these ways to build in the design tropes, but in a way that like can be as natural as possible, and then sometimes you're just like, screw it. There's no way to naturally put this in.
Yeah.
And then bam, now you're inside. And this was the part that the producer had built, and it was described as like, hey, it's a circular traversal all the way to the top, and we'll do, some navigation and some combat throughout. And they just looked at it as, oh, well, that's really simple. You just described it. I could just build that, right? And the producer had been an artist before, so he thought it's no big deal. And just metrics-wise, it was just a disaster. Oh. None of the jumps were consistent. He kept falling down all over the place. It was a really good lesson, I think, for him and many other people, that there's a lot more that goes into designing a level than just building it in 3D, right? Yeah. Like there's a lot more thought that has to go into all of that.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're not going to go through the whole interior sequence of the Colossus here, but I just wanted to say thanks for sitting through and adding some commentary and some insight here for us.
Absolutely, it's fun to actually see this after all these years.
And Tim, thank you for playing. I know there's some challenging bits there, but we appreciate it.
You made it very dramatic for us, Tim. Great job.
Yeah. So this was actually the PS3 version, not the PS2 version on the collection. But and there it is. There's the end.
Fantastic.
Thanks again, guys.
Perfectly ended.